Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. As everyone knows by now, the US and Israel launched airstrikes on Iran Saturday with the stated aim of regime change. Supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, is dead, the conflict is ongoing, and to understand what it means for Turkey, I spoke to Hürcan Aslı Aksoy, a senior fellow at the Center for Applied Turkey Studies at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, also known as SWP. She outlined the top considerations for Ankara as the war expands across the region. We also talked about what the conflict means for Turkey-Israel power competition across multiple spheres of influence. That's the subject of her recent analysis for SWP, which covers Turkey-Israel escalation risks in Syria, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Horn of Africa. Check the show notes for the link. A quick note, this talk was recorded Monday, March 2nd at 3 p.m. Turkey time, or about noon UTC. Let's get into it. Thanks for joining us, Aslı.
Thank you for having me.
So, what does this new phase of the US-Israel war against Iran mean for Turkey?
I mean, first we have to state what Israel's objective is. It's basically a strategic rollback. That means weakening Iran's security architecture or deterrence architecture by firstly degrading its missile capabilities, and as Netanyahu has been repeatedly said, constraining its nuclear power and disrupting the whole security network and proxy infrastructure, so that Iran cannot at all project power in the region. But sometimes they say stability, sometimes they say instability, but I think Netanyahu or Israel would be happy to have just a weak Iran, disordered Iran. But Ankara is concerned because, it's another instability in the region, and in a wider war actually directly affects Turkey in several dimensions. First of all, we already talk about the energy price shocks and surely trade and transit disruptions. And, the EU Commissar von der Leyen has talked to President Erdogan about, constraining the refugee flows already. And there are also broader security risks at Ankara's immediate border. So Ankara is extremely worried that the war continues and will have spillover effects. So we see that there are differences between Israeli and Turkish threat perceptions. That's why Ankara has been calling for de-escalation and stopping the war. In advance, they have been also trying to convince the Americans not to start a war against Iran. But Israel, on the other hand, sees a continued pressure on Iran as necessary for long-term security of the country. So, in a nutshell, Israel is thinking a strategic rollback, while Turkey is thinking in terms of a spillover control, we can say.
Yeah, and we haven't seen reports of anything happening in Turkish territory or along Turkish borders from what I've seen. Have you seen anything?
No. Iranians have been attacking the U.S. military bases in United Arab Emirates, and then I heard also about the energy, the oil production sites in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, but they haven't done anything on the Turkish soil. Neither was anything from Israel. I mean, Turkey is a NATO country, so we shouldn't forget that.
Which means if a NATO country gets attacked, the other NATO allies have to
Yeah, I
support
mean,
that
there
country.
are American nuclear missiles in Turkey, so I think it's not only Washington's ally, but there are also American arms within Turkey's territory.
Yeah, so to look at the regional dynamics, Turkey and Israel have a rivalry. So how does this conflict in Iran shift the balance between Turkey and Israel? Because before this conflict, many analysts were saying Israel's becoming a regional hegemon. It's flexing its power, it's showing its force throughout the region, and only Turkey really stands as the other regional military power that would compete with Israel. What do you make of the power balance in the region as these developments continue?
I mean, hegemon means that there will be only one actor, but I don't think it's valid for the region. But it definitely changed the picture since Iran has been weakening since 7th of October, but this attacks seriously challenges Iran's own positioning and its structure and everything. Israel is has quite a strong military, that's for sure. Also nuclear power, American ally. So is Turkey. Turkey is also an American ally, is a NATO member. So I don't think that we should talk about hegemons, but we should talk about more deepened strategic rivalry within the region. While Turkey really wants to have more regional stability. That's why Ankara has been talking to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and also in Iraq, is trying to gather different actors together to somehow contain Israeli aggressiveness in the region. This is how Ankara sees, and still pushing for diplomatic channels to prevent broader destabilization. Whereas with Israel, we see more pressure and more military operations. And I think this stems from two different regional visions, actually. I think Israel is pretty much interested in a destabilized region where it feels quite, more safe, that no one can challenge Israeli dominance. Whereas Ankara wants to have decreased the military escalations and conflicts because it has had repercussions from destabilization, be it security-wise, be it economically, be it refugee-wise. So if the war continues for a long time, it's quite clear there will be also refugee pressure on Turkey, which Turkey really wants to hinder. And we have heard all the border passings were, strictly controlled. As far as I remember, based on the open sources, there are only 2 border passings from Iran that will allow people to enter the country. But yeah, Ankara is pretty much alarmed. I would wrap up by saying the strategic rivalry is deepening through the war in Iran.
Would a weaker Iran or different regime in Iran change the calculus between Turkey and Israel, or is it too much speculation at this point?
It's too much speculation. I mean, maybe you read the statement of President Erdogan. He gave his condolences for the death of Khamenei, the Iranian cleric leader, and wishes the best for the Iranian population, whereas we hear from Netanyahu and other Israeli political figures that the Iranians now should stand up and change the regime. But we are not sure what's going to happen in Iran because, as far as I see, there is no concrete plan for neither from Washington nor from Tel Aviv, Israel, for the next day. So what kind of a regime should be in Iran? But as I said before, I think Netanyahu is also fine. There is just a weak Iran with still the same regime, but with weakened political figures. We heard already the new heads of the state, not heads of the state, but the clerics have been discussed within Iran. So I think this week will be very important for making further predictions. But I
Uh,
would right now rather restrain, like putting quite clear or forward-looking or making statements.
for sure. And understandable, we don't know what's going to happen. And a lot depends on how things end up being on the ground in Iran.
Yes.
Normally, I should say, regime change through airstrikes is a complicated and controversial matter, if I can put it that way. There's a
Yeah.
lot to go there, but that's a different podcast. Let's focus on Turkey-Israel relations and just could you provide some context to what was going on between those two nations prior to the strikes in Iran? Because Erdogan has been very critical of Israel policy since the October 7th attacks by Hamas and then the resulting destruction of Gaza, displacement of civilians, and then just this broader regional conflict, which seems to be continuing today. Um, where were Turkey-Israel relations before this weekend's strikes?
I mean, it's a complicated relationship actually. Since 7th of October, as you said, the relations have shifted from difficult partnership to an open rivalry, as I also stated in my policy brief. But if you go back to 1990s, actually, Israel and Turkey were close partners. They had very strong diplomatic, economic, military, and intelligence links, actually. But since the early 2000s or mid 2000s rather, the relations have deteriorated substantially. I also suggested in my analysis that we can state this back to Erdogan's rise to power. Uh, he's obviously an important political figure from the Turkish Islamist movement, and he had a very clear perspective on Israel. So it hasn't changed in the last 25 years, but Turkey had always very pragmatic relations with Israel. So many things have happened, such as the Marmara case and Davos and everything. So from the 2010s to 2023, the relations had ups and downs. That's why it used to be difficult partnership. The only continuous part was, or dimension was, the economic relations. But October 7th has changed many things, and the structural rift has become even larger. What do I mean by that? That they have like two different visions for the region, but their structural changes or their structural rift comes from two forces. One of them is domestic political dynamics, and the second one is the shifting regional power balance. What I mean by domestic political dynamics, we both know both Erdogan and Netanyahu intentionally sharpen their foreign policy disputes rhetorically. So they accuse each other and use words such as the Führer or Sultan, and then they are very sharp in their rhetoric. It serves to two aims. One, they both want to consolidate their support domestically, and second, they want to shift attention away from internal problems in Turkey, from the economic and political problems, and the same is valid for Israel. And we both know the region has changed, not since the Arab uprising in 2011, like Syrian civil war, and but since the October 7 immensely, and they both operate in fragmenting regional order. And there are long-standing conflicts. There are deep mistrust among the actors. The alliances are shifting every couple of years, and there is a high volatility in the region. So in this environment, in this regional environment, strategic competition is increasingly intensifying. Multiple interconnected arenas, be it Syria, be it Gaza, and coming to Eastern Mediterranean, and so that is the situation right now. That is the current state of Turkey-Israeli relations, that they kind of put themselves in opposite poles, and the tension is rising.
Yeah, and you referenced your report, your analysis. It's in German. It's on the CATS website, SWP. I'm not going to try to pronounce it in German, but in English, it translates to Turkey, Israel, risky escalation in a fragmented regional order. I'll link to it in the show notes. One of the main things that your report does is kind of give the context for the relations between Turkey and Israel, but it also goes into the different regional places they're competing. I do want to do that and go around the region to see where they're competing. Before that, can you just comment on why Turkish troops may not play a role in peacekeeping efforts in Gaza? Because this is the main question that people think about when they think about Turkey-Israel relations. Can Turkey play a role in a post-war Gaza?
Mm-hmm. I mean, Ankara has repeatedly suggested that it will contribute to reconstruction of Gaza through humanitarian aid, logistics, and funding, and so. As you also know, American President Trump, has invited Erdogan to be a member of the Board of Peace for Gaza. But we also repeatedly heard from Netanyahu and other Israeli officials that they are firmly opposing Turkish participation in Gaza's reconstruction and any Turkish troops' presence. because it will contradict Israel's deterrence doctrine. So they see Turkey as a threat. We heard from the former Israeli foreign minister. Right now, the video is revolving around Twitter, although it's a little older. And they don't want to have, a powerful military in Gaza, and they want to control everything 100%. What happens in Gaza, and they don't want to have any outside influence, especially from actors such as Turkey. And the second part of this opposition to Turkish presence is it's quite clear Turkish leadership's rhetoric, because they see Hamas as not as a terrorist organization, and they see Turkish leadership as close to Hamas, and this is hugely problematic for Israel. So they cannot accept any actor who did not call Hamas terrorist and kind of also helped this Hamas's leadership. So that's why Israel is opposing Turkish troops being in Gaza.
Yeah, and the second most often mentioned sphere of influence that Turkey and Israel face often is Syria after the transition to the Shura government after the fall of Assad in 2024. You wrote in your report that both Turkey and Israel have very fundamentally opposing visions of the future.
Yeah.
Can you go into what that means and how it's playing out right now?
I mean, Ankara, after changing all its aims during the Assad regime, so now we know that Ankara envisions a post-war Syria as a stable, centralized state that is territorially intact. That's a very clear line from Ankara. And in doing so, the most important step was the integration of Kurdish militias linked to the PKK under the Syrian Democratic Forces. Then after the Arab parts, Arab actors have dissolved from the SDF, it is basically YPG. They want the integration of those into the central authority, and that's happening right now. And Turkey's support for Syria's reconstruction is really strengthening the central state's control over the whole territory. No Kurdish autonomous structures. Kurdish structures should be integrated into the Syrian interim government. So, what is important for Turkey is border security. Surely it has a very long border with Syria, and still maintaining leverage through its military presence in northern Syria, because the Syrian interim government is still not ready to take over the control in the northern territories where the Turkish military has kind of established and functioning state-like structures, be it the schools and health sector and so on and so forth. But if you hear and read about what Israel has been thinking, it's contrasting to the Turkish perspective. So they still see the new government in Damascus as a potential strategic risk because, they used to be the jihadist actors. So it actually favored a weaker, more decentralized Syria. So we have seen this last year I think it was in the summer. They supported the Druze militias, and they were also rhetorically supporting the Kurdish actors. So, and what is their main objective is actually constraining Turkish influence in Syria. So, while Israel has expanded its presence in southern Syria, Turkey has expanded Turkey was in the northern Syria. So they have a completely opposite vision of Syria. But since Israel has agreed with the interim government, Syrian government, the things are right now relatively stabilized. But as we all say, it's highly volatile. So we don't know if the government under al-Shara can really control everything in its military. The basic line is Turkey wants to see a centralized Syria and a strong central state. whereas Israel wants to see it decentralized. Syria, it doesn't necessarily mean that, the autonomous structures, but a rather weak Syria is in favor of Israel, so that there will be no military challenge for Israel.
I mean, a lot of people, now that these Iran strikes happen, are connecting dots backwards. So U.S. Troops left Syria, the southern Syria base that they had there, and then they're viewing the SDF territorial losses in a different light. There's a lot of unknowns, and I don't want to speculate, but I do want to ask what your opinion is on the previous rhetoric that Israel had an interest in supporting the Kurdish enclave held by the SDF in Syria, and how this factors into the relation. Because, as we know, when the Damascus forces, Shara's military forces, made the offensive in January, Israel did not intervene, right? It didn't. I don't remember many statements coming out of
No.
Israeli government officials either. Can you just comment on Israel's relations with the SDF and what might have happened there?
I mean, actually, it didn't surprise me because we just heard from the Israeli officials on a rhetoric level, a support for the Kurdish autonomy. Kurds has to be, used to have their rights. They shouldn't, integrate into the Syrian. But we haven't seen any attempt to build up a mechanism between Israelis and Kurds directly that we know of, right? So I was wondering also back then, before the attacks in Aleppo, so how would Israel do that? Because in the Druze case, they attacked immediately the Syrian military sites, and they showed that they have to stop. The attacks against the Druze minority has to stop. But we haven't seen that in the Kurdish case, or in the Kurdish held areas in Syria. But it doesn't mean that things will remain the same. But right now, Israel is preoccupied with Iran. If they will shift their focus towards Kurds, I don't think so. And there, I think the important player was the US. So the US has kept both Israel and Turkey apart. I mean, you remember maybe when Netanyahu was visiting Washington. I mean, he has been visiting Washington quite several times, but in one case, he said the Turks will be dealing with Syria. So, and Netanyahu was just nodding. Therefore, I think Israelis, if the Israelis would change their relations toward the Kurds in a substantial way, they should first pass through the Americans, I think. That's what I can say for now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I won't ask about Kurds in Iran because that will be full speculation, but I will ask about the East Med, where both Turkey and Israel are competing for influence and, let's say, energy and security domains. In December 2025, Greece, the Republic of Cyprus, and Israel signed a trilateral work plan, which oversees military cooperation and joint drills and training. Obviously, this was not welcome in Ankara. This looks like organization against Turkey. How do you view it? And can you just lay out some of the security considerations that are present in both Ankara and Israel at the moment?
I mean, it started in 2020 when Turkey was extremely aggressive in the Eastern Mediterranean, and there was also the tension between the EU and Turkey because Ankara was left out from the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, so there were the energy concerns first, right? And Ankara perceived this as a deliberate strategic exclusion run by Israel. But we have seen since then that both Greece and the Republic of Cyprus have intensified their cooperation with Israel. So, and we have been also closely observing that while Mitsotakis had changed the relations with Ankara, or the relations become less tense between Ankara and Athens, he was underlining the strategic partnership with Israel is extremely important. It won't change, that we come closer to Ankara. We have this exchange, high-level exchanges. So, and also Republic of Cyprus, obviously. But the security situation, Ankara sees, of course, Israel's expansion in the Eastern Mediterranean as a challenge, and as a military challenge. And Israel is widening its own regional presence. Therefore, it gives more gas, or it accelerates the competition over maritime zones. I mean, there are debate between the Greek and the Turkish counterparts anyway, so it has not been solved for decades. And there are also competition about the energy resources, but also security formats. But the interesting thing is, we shouldn't forget, Israel and Republic of Cyprus, they are not member of NATO, whereas Greece and Turkey are NATO members. So if there will be a tension, there are mechanisms that can, solve the tension between Greece and Turkey. But there are no mechanism that can solve the tension between Turkey and Israel, or Turkey and the Republic of Cyprus, except the diplomatic channels, of course, or or a conflict, military, encounter. So security-wise, we will see further. I mean, the security logic is always related, or closely related, with energy resources as well. And there, of course, is again the Americans are playing an important role. I don't know if you have also heard about it. British and Italian companies withdrew from the drilling, but the American companies entered again. And I
Chevron,
think it
right?
was by green lighted. Yeah, yeah. So I think Eni and Shell withdrew, and Chevron entered for specific areas in the Eastern Mediterranean for drilling and so. And I personally think, I can neither confirm nor deny that has happened also by the green light of Ankara. I think Energy Minister has said something about that I cannot quote at the moment, but it was approved by the Turkish officials.
We'll have to look into that. The last big region that we need to talk about is Somalia and Somaliland. Somaliland is the breakaway
Yeah.
region in northwestern Somalia, across the Gulf of Aden from Yemen, if anyone's looking at a map. In December, Israel became the first nation to recognize Somaliland as an independent country. And this is controversial in many ways, primarily for Somalian leaders in Mogadishu, but also for Turkey, because Turkey has its largest foreign military base in Somalia, and it has very strong relations with the central government there. You outlined this in your report with a lot of details. Can you just unpack some of the major points about Turkish relations with Somalia and why Erdogan was against this move, which again is, Israel is the first country to do it. So it's not, I don't think anybody approved of this move, from what I
No,
understand.
not yet. First of all, we should remember why Horn of Africa is of strategic importance. Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea is quite important, and Houthis are aligned with Iran, and they were openly firing missiles to Israeli ships, and by saying that it's a kind of a retaliation for Israel's war in Gaza. It is one of the most critical maritime corridors. Roughly 14% of global seaborne trade goes through Red Sea, and 30% of the container traffic pass. So that's why it's highly important. That is also why one of the reasons why Turkey is interested in that region, but also Israel and Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. So and after the Houthi attacks, were looking at the Red Sea because it also fit into their security calculations. That's why came this Israel's recognition with Somaliland, as Israel's recognition of Somaliland. But this is, of course, a direct challenge for Turkey, as you briefly mentioned, because first of all, Turkey significantly expanded its presence since 2011. Turkey is not only, investing in infrastructure projects, humanitarian aid, it it has a diplomatic engagement, but there is also, as you mentioned, the biggest military base outside of Cyprus in Somalia, and they are training really the military troops of central government. So and Somalia is central for Turkey's ambition to project political influence not only in the Horn but for the whole of Africa and the Red Sea. So Turkey is also interested in ports. Before al-Bashir's toppling, Turkey was also in Sudan. So Turkey wants to play a role in, from the economic perspective by kind of holding or managing the ports as well. So the recognition of Somaliland gives, of course, or we thought that it gives Israel a kind of a maritime leverage, and it weakens, of course, the authority of the Somali federal government. And Somali federal government is the key partner of Turkey. So one will ask, of course, while Turkey is there, how could it happen that Israel comes and recognizes an enclave within Somalia that makes a bad repetition for Ankara, for its strategic partner and guarantor of Somalia's territorial integrity. But what is important and what I suggest or argue in my analysis is Israeli-Turkish rivalry is not only played out in Syria or in Gaza or in Eastern Mediterranean, but it also spreads. It went beyond the Middle East. So now it has not only the security dimension, but also maritime and geoeconomic dimension. And all these interconnected areas make the escalation. I mean, raises the risk of escalation between these two countries, and it pushes also new alliance building. We immediately have seen after December 2025 that Turkey talked to Saudi Arabia and Egypt to kind of constrain Israel and United Arab Emirates in the Horn of Africa, and Turkey immediately moved or brought its F-16s to Egypt and Somalia, in case a conflict starts there as well. So all the regional actors are pretty much interested in the Horn of Africa, and I think it will also remain on the agenda in the coming year. I mean, in 2026 and further.
Yeah, and just like Turkey signed that MOU with Libya to get access to the exclusive economic zone in the Mediterranean, you also see that if Israel, I'm wondering, I imagine that if Israel recognizes Somaliland, that would create some kind of maritime issues for
Yeah.
Turkey in the Gulf of Aden and the coast of Somalia, because I don't see many new reports, but I know that some Turkish drilling ships were heading for the coast of Somalia to explore some energy resources, and these would be escorted by Turkish Navy ships.
Mm-hmm.
So if Israel recognizes a country and claims that it has its own maritime zone, I really wonder what that means. Is there anything you can say about this?
I mean, we know that the Turkish Navy is already there, but this with maritime zones, Turkey is not part of this international agreement on sea, so there will be just a conflict, but if only one land recognizes Somaliland, I don't know how it will be played out. Israel cannot single-handedly push the exclusive economic zones in the region. I don't think so. But if there will be several countries or more than 10 countries, then it would be definitely a huge problem, like in Libya. Then we can also see a military conflict or even war there. So the war is already in Sudan, and there are also conflicts in Eritrea, Ethiopia. So the region is anyway under fire, and it will spill over to other countries as well. But I think it will be kind of a military overstretch for Turkey and Israel and other countries as well, because right now, this realignment among Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt shows that they want to decrease they want a de-escalation. They do not want to have an escalation, and now we have Iran anyway. So I don't think that Israel's recognition of the exclusive economic zone at the moment brings something, unless, like I said, other countries decide to recognize the Somali.
Mhm. No, thank you for that. To finish,
Yeah.
on that escalation point, the U.S. is considered the moderator, mediator between Turkey and Israel. The U.S. is also participating in the bombing of Iran. How does this all factor together? Where's this going? Do you have any forward-looking projections? I mean, I'm guessing the U.S. is not a neutral moderator at this point in the Turkey-Israel rivalry.
I mean, this is a $1 million question, of course, since the Trump presidency, second presidency in the US. And if you look at Iran, the US is definitely not a non-partisan actor, but it still plays a crucial role if you look at the bilateral relations between Israel and Turkey. So, and the US can use incentives to restrain both of the actors. So, and both have very good relations with Washington at the moment, and neither Ankara nor Israel wants to jeopardize their relationship with Washington, because they both need Washington. Until now, we have seen that President Trump used its good relations with Erdogan and its relations with Netanyahu, kind of kept this diplomatic engagement, and Witkoff and Kushner were also not only in Israel but also in Turkey, and it's kind of a strategic signaling to Ankara, just I will have Israel under my control. Therefore, we can say not as a constraint, but a kind of a ceiling on escalation. Washington functions as a ceiling on escalation. And Turkey and Israel would calibrate their regional actions with US's reactions in mind. That's for sure. But this does not eliminate rivalry. It just prevents from crossing into direct confrontation between these two. But what I suggest is, looking from Berlin, we should be careful, because if Washington is preoccupied with other things, be it Iran, but also domestically, and both countries come across each other, and accidents happen. So there will be unintended consequences. This is also what I say in my analysis. So therefore, I don't suggest that the US does resolve the rivalry. I just suggest it sets the outer limits within which both sides operate until now. So that will be my take on it.
To wrap, that was Hürcan Aslı Aksoy, a senior fellow at the Center for Applied Turkey Studies at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, also known as SWP. This podcast is a production of Turkey Recap, a newsletter on Turkish politics, foreign policy, and business. If you like what you heard, visit turkeyrecap.com for more coverage from right here in Ankara. We also have a Turkish language newsletter and podcast at studiorecap.com. Feedback is always welcome. Send suggestions and questions to info@turkeyrecap.com. Stay safe, stay well, and see you next time.